Hello, honeys, and welcome to the fifth and final chapter of our series, Art That Pisses People Off. Today, our episode is titled Going Bananas, and if that's not a huge enough hint that we will be talking all about food art history today, then I'm not entirely sure what is. We'll be taking a tour through history, looking at the past before we get back to the present to understand what exactly has changed over the centuries and with various movements. I did want to apologize for any confusion right off the bat, though, regarding our Honey Drop, the new release. Turns out I am a bit of a grandpa with technology, or at least ones I'm new to. I was not aware that there was a difference between publishing something and saving something on our Patreon platform, but that episode is now available if you want to go ahead and give it a listen. I would really appreciate it, as every download will help me continue to provide you with brand new content. A quick note that today's sources include everything from the Met Museum to LACMA to OSU, as well as very recognized publications like Frieze and Art Forum, so no need to worry that this information is accurate, although, as always, the source doc is available through the link in the episode description. So at last, here we go, ATPPO number 5, Going Bananas. As long as there has been a history of art, there has been a practice of depicting food and or the act of feasting all the way from antiquity to the Middle Ages. Most of the time, these banquets were focused on depicting the sorts of passions that were popularly celebrated in literature, painting, mosaics. But then in the 15th century, artists start taking more and more inspiration from the culture of antiquity and from the natural world, and they begin to depict fruits, wine vessels, flora, fauna, in secular as well as devotional images. The transition from the old Roman style of using baskets of fruit or foodstuffs as visual parts of representations to gods, now it was beginning to become its own symbol, a sort of part of the narrative. Whereas in the 16th century in Italy and even earlier in some parts of Europe, these depictions of food or feasts really only existed as part of a bigger story. They were never the plot themselves. There were two primary purposes to still lifes and other such images that focus almost exclusively on food and other inanimate objects. They could serve as reminders of mortality or time's passage, though that became a much more popular trend later. The more dominant reason, at least in that time, was that these items allowed an artist to display their observation and painting skills by accurately depicting color, shape, texture. There also was some symbolism behind food and drink rooted in classical literature. For example, there are some that appear alongside saints or different mythological figures as a way to identify them. However, they can also be metaphors for virtue and vice. Two fruits in particular, the pomegranate and the apple, are widely used in the case of the former as a way to identify Venus or a symbol of desire or fertility. It also can be a symbol of marriage because of the myth of Persephone. And the apple, of course, has a whole lot of biblical Adam and Eve associations, especially to do with sin and knowledge. There is one honorable mention I would like to make at this time, an Italian artist by the name of Giuseppe Arcimboldo. He lived from either 1526 or 27, history's not entirely sure, to 1593, and he's known for making really funny, bizarre portraits where there are, depending on which way you hold the canvas, either bouquets of vegetables or images of faces made of vegetables. He makes portraits out of these, meat, game pieces, all sorts of things. Though his timeline fits in more so with the Mannerist artists, he could be considered one of the earliest surrealists, especially with the circa 1590 work, The Fruit Basket, which is often considered the epitome of his illusions. As time passes, so does the meaning of these edible goods. Art historians widely recognize that until the 17th century, still life had been essentially a part of historical or mythological or religious genres, a sort of happenstance, but by that point, the 17th century, still life starts to become its own independent and recognized genre, especially in the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. During that time, foodstuffs and various fancy serving vessels were depicted with extraordinarily high levels of realism and detail. They were extremely popular amongst the newly affluent, brand new, for the first time in history, middle class, who were not only able to appreciate the actual skillfulness behind the art, but they were able to understand the significance of the goods depicted, because expensive delicacies like shellfish or lemons or even hunting trophies of rare game or fowl were obviously associated with a privileged life that either the owner had or wanted to be identified with. It was, for this new merchant class, the status symbol artwork. One extremely famous art historical name, the Lombard painter Caravaggio, who lived 1517 to 1610, did a lot to validate this genre and expand it by including still life elements into religious and allegorical works in a way that was considered shockingly naturalistic by viewers at the time. The Met notes that even as the popularity of still lifes as a genre began to wane, especially in the Netherlands, the symbolic potency of this kind of work still goes on well into the 18th century and beyond. Again, why they matter is, though they were initially considered a minor genre, still lifes soon became the identifying and trendy genre of the bourgeoisie. Furthermore, they are an important visual record that reflects the entry points, times really, of different exotic fruits and animals into Europe. So we can truly see what goods became available when by looking at these still lifes. As if that information isn't valuable enough, the evolution of the genre coincides with the humanistic and scientific studies of nature done in the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the main exponents of the still life genre, in fact, is a Dutch painter by the name of Clara Peters, an extremely valuable, if slightly underrepresented figure not only in art history but biology also. She worked in Antwerp in the first half of the 17th century and is remembered for her great ability to capture natural figures, flora and fauna, with precise detail. Still lifes can even help us understand a bit more about what American life was like in the newly formed nation in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as artists, American ones, gave focus to ordinary everyday objects, says the Stair Galleries. Food-centered still lifes allow us to look into their ideas about social values, the ideas about the country's new wealth and abundance, and even some of the opinions surrounding the dramatic social, political, and industrial changes within the United States at the time. This continued into the Gilded Age as well, when some painters depicted all sorts of glamour and wealth, conspicuous consumption, while still life painters continued to choose simple foods related to the working class as a subject and social commentary. Finally, that century saw a huge jump in the purpose of still lifes as memento moris, which is basically the concept of art that reminds us through various symbols of life, death, aging, so on, like withering flowers, that, life is not eternal, that we are not going to be here forever, and we should, in fact, be aware of death, which makes sense for the Victorian era and how much death was occurring due to not only illness but also industrial overworking. Even more time passes and the turn of the century comes around, at which point we start to see the very first of the lowercase m modernism movements. One we know for sure launched a movement is his not popularly known Apple Basket. A quick summary of him for you guys. He was French, lived 1839 to 1906, and he's always been associated with the Impressionists as well as the Fauvists. He's well known for making dozens of versions of the hillside in Provence across various lighting conditions as well as seasons as a way to investigate atmospheric effects on perceived color. He had a significant influence on Picasso and the general development of 20th century art. The apples in question, aka the painting Still Life with Basket of Apples, completed between 1890 and 94, is very highly regarded, not only according to the Art Institute of Chicago for its vivid colors and perfectly balanced composition, but also because Cézanne employed multiple perspectives in the image. He therefore challenged the idea of the linear or receding to one point perspective and indicated that human perspective, therefore, is more complex than the standard vision we're familiar with. By investigating the still life beyond the subject, instead looking at visual perception from various angles and various planes of the object, he highlights two-dimensionality and opened the doors for 20th century cubists such as Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso. Though Cézanne's apples are far less known than many of Picasso's works, they are an incredibly crucial moment in art history. The next time we see such a massive creation of artworks featuring food is in the context of the mid-century, more specifically with the development of pop art in the 1960s. Stare Galleries notes that in that decade, many pop artists from Warhol, Lichtenstein, Oldenburg to more used food to focus on issues not only of modern mass production and its effects on society, but also questions of graphic design and advertising and their relationship to quote-unquote high art forms. Many pop artists used food as a visual metaphor in order to comment on various American appetites as well as elements of culture. And still others, such as Wayne Thibault, used depictions of cakes, gumball machines, and others to draw on American nostalgia and collective food memories. A notable bit of context for this focus on food in the 50s and 60s. In post-war America, the production of food was finally free from the years of rationing, and it was becoming mass-produced. This meant not only that food became very homogenized in the sense that everybody from millionaires to the working classes to the president were eating all the same Wonder Bread, but it also raised questions about what it meant to have factory and mass-produced food items, what it meant to consume them. Articles produced by The Ohio State University note, quote, "Pop art, by contrast to abstract expressionism as the dominant quote-unquote high art, embraced mundane commercialism. Contemporary interpretations of pop art range from a subversive critique of American consumerism and a warning about the shrinking gap between human and machine to a legitimation of the joy that products can bring to our lives, end quote. A series that blends all of those philosophies of pop art that I just covered, the commoditization, the nostalgia, all of it, are Warhol's very famous soup cans. This is because, as many art historical sources note, by choosing to render them as silkscreens, as artistic subjects, publicizing and monetizing them as fine art commodities, Warhol created a body of works that is as universal as the soup cans themselves. A quick reminder about the life of Warhol. He lived 1928 through 1987. He's considered one of the most important American artists of the second half of the 20th century and is by far one of the most well-known artists of all time. The original soup can series consists of 32 20 by 16 inch screen printed canvases, one for each of the varieties of Campbell's soup sold at the time. They are originally presented linearly, resting on a shelf mounted on a wall in an effort to sort of playfully poke at the way grocery stores display the cans and evoke elements of that shopping experience. The works were shown for the first time in early July of 1962 in the Ferris Gallery of LA. It was his first solo exhibition and was largely uneventful as it had a pretty low attendance rate. Warhol himself supposedly didn't even show. A second showing in New York later that year was apparently also canceled, yet the works managed to capture public attention and go down in history anyway. Warhol famously, in an allusion to projection tracing done by masters of the past, used similar techniques to create the soup cans, projecting the image of them onto blank canvases, tracing the outline and details, then carefully filling them in using old-fashioned brushes and paint. Though he used this alongside a hand stamp to make sure that the fleur-de-lis patterns around the label's bottom edges were exact, small inconsistencies reveal that they were in fact handmade. The soup can series embodies an inherent contradiction of pop art in that they use fine art techniques to depict an everyday manufactured object and are clearly supposed to look as though they were made mechanically, yet there are ever so slight differences, not only between the different flavor labels, show in fact that they are the results of an artist's efforts. Obviously, Warhol's works go down in legend once the public and critics get over the shock of seeing such a thing for the first time. They eventually warm up to them because, in part, the soup can series made art fun. They were accessible in the sense that they didn't make your brain work too hard. Critics especially began to see the ironic humor in these quote-unquote portraits of the various flavors. The original purchaser of the set of 32, one Irving Blum, realized that the effect of the works is heightened when they're kept together, so he bought them all, and in 1996, the MoMA bought them from Blum as a combination gift and sale, valued upwards of $15 million. That number seems all the more astronomical considering he bought them for only $1,000 in '62. As was one of the intentions of pop art, many viewers today are able to view them and feel a sense of nostalgia. Every print and thus every flavor has the opportunity to connect with different viewers in different ways. And with their slight errors, they are all the more handmade seeming and touching for it. In the 1960s, Warhol's cans were seen as sterile, cold, and mechanical. These days, they are seen in a world of high tech media marketing and airbrushed ads, the same way for many Americans as we might view items from our grandma's kitchens. An incredibly important, almost intermediary figure, and one who I was recently reminded of as she is featured in a relatively new Phoenix Art Museum exhibition that I saw Sunday. Let's talk about Natalia LL for a minute. LL was a Polish artist who lived from 1937 to very recently, 2022. She largely borrowed from pornography as well as advertising in order to take close critical looks at how women were presented in the media overall. She was born Natalia Lach and grew up in the industrial southern city of Bielsko-Biala. She earned her MSc, the equivalent of an MS degree, from the State College of Fine Arts, which is now the Eugenues Geppert Academy of Fine Arts in Wrocław in 1963. She later earned another diploma before founding the collective PermaFo with Zbigniew Dlubek and Andrzej Lechowicz. The trio ran a gallery of the same name through 1891, and which was frequently seen as a very important hub for developing the Polish avant-garde. Natalia LL went on to marry Lechowicz in 1971, hence her abbreviated surname down to the initials LL. By 1975, she'd become very involved with the international feminist movement and was making some of her best known as well as most controversial works. But in the late 70s, she became seriously ill, and upon her recovery, she shifted to more spiritual and mythological subjects. Of these later works, Natalia Sielowicz, a curator and art historian at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, says, quote, her video performances Artificial Reality, 1976, Pyramid, 1979, and Points of Support, 1980, synthesized conceptual art with cosmist and shamanist practices. Her many attempts to visualize the intimate and the unconscious, which she understood as operations on signs and meanings, were the result of rational and objectified actions, unquote. One of those incredibly famous, feminist, and controversial works is Consumer Art of 1974. As I was so kindly reminded by the Phoenix Art Museum, it was originally a video but is now often presented as a series of still photos. The models, including herself, suggestively eat, suck on, etc. sexualized foods like sausages, bananas, and ice cream, using the symbology of the food and the performance of quote-unquote sexy acts to reveal and subvert how mass media sexualizes women by undermining, by satirizing this expected sexiness. Frieze explains its importance to art history by noting that it has been celebrated as a very strong, supportive piece for sex positivity. It's also an important, ironic metaphor for the what they call consumption poor lives within state socialism systems during the Cold War, during which time the series was produced. Although Poland had technically broken away from socialist realist doctrine by 1974, when Consumer Art was produced, there was a sort of equally dangerous and dogmatic pendulum swing towards purist and moralist conceptual art by the rest of the Polish art scene. In this context, Natalia LL's work stood out and sent its messages even more clearly. Ultimately, the scarcity of goods, the hunger problems, especially in the Polish People's Republic of the artist's day, led her to explore intersections between consumerism and feminism within her society, within this context that expected women to be both homemakers and workers when so little materially was available to them. She'd always had a strong interest in the body, especially the female body and gender fluidity, that set her apart from the majority of the Polish avant-garde, and this film/photographic series is her using that voice to continue to make pointed, critical statements that nobody else would. As one can imagine, consumer art was pretty controversial on its debut, but fascinatingly, it remains so to this day. The Museum of Art in Warsaw notes that Peter Piotrowski remarked in the 70s, when Polish communist mass culture was highly Puritan and lots of food products seen in the works consumed by these models were really impossible to reach, the film might have actually had the unintentional and adverse effect of promoting consumption by making these goods seem all the more appealing. That's a fairly thoughtful and interesting critique coming out of her own day. Art Forum notes that with her works often brash and provocative, Natalia LL has on numerous occasions been the target of censorship, whether that's because of social fretting or repressive governments. We saw most of the former earlier in her career, but we've actually seen the latter more recently. I'm referencing how in 2019, consumer art pieces, photographs, were withdrawn from the Warsaw's National Museum, calling attention to an increasingly conservative cultural climate in that nation, sparking nationwide protests and raising the question worldwide of what to this day is considered appropriate art or not. And finally, honeys, we have made it back to contemporary times. We have essentially two artworks that will summarize, I think, pretty nicely where we're at in regards to food and contemporary art. So first, let's talk a little bit about Rigri Tirvaniha's food works. Tirvaniha is Argentine-born in 1961, but Canadian-trained, known very well for participatory installations. He has, more specifically, provided communal meals in work from a piece titled Untitled, empty parentheses, back in 1989 all the way to the present. But we are going to talk about Untitled, aka Free, of 1992 and also 2019, because it will allow us to bridge the gap between the 90s, the Y2Ks, and the 20-teens. In 92, as the story goes, the artist created an exhibition at 303 Gallery in New York that was received with perplexity but great joy, says the curator of the show. There are some extant video clips of interviews from exhibition visitors who mainly focused in their discussion of it on the memorability of the event, the chance nature of the experience, the activation of their various senses, and their interactions with other people. The piece was later recreated at MoMA as part of the installation Contemporary Galleries 1980 through now. The artist worked with the institution to make it again to scale, with curry prepared once more and served by the museum's restaurant staff daily as it had been in the original piece. At the Horshorn in 2019, one more installation of it was done, though this version featured graphite images on the very stark white gallery walls. These images showed ones of pain and protest, death and marching, everything from Dr. Martin Luther King's famous 1963 March on Washington to images that appeared to reference more recent Taiwanese uprisings. We will spend just a moment longer on those graphite images because they're fascinating in that they are constantly evolving. Tirvaniha says, quote, "The idea is to draw over other images and layer it until the wall will become completely black. It will become more layered and complex, but eventually everything will be so covered people will forget, end quote. Pretty significant purpose there. Everything becomes so covered that everyone forgets. Separate yet attached rooms will feature certain related films by the same artist. In some ways, the 2019 Hirshhorn was a specific extension of the 2010 Bangkok version titled Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Green? The trio pairing not only refers to the three basic colors of curry, but according to Smithsonian Magazine, could also refer to various political factions that are at odds in contemporary Thailand. Red for rural activists, yellow for royalists, and green for the ever-hovering military. It could also be a reference to a series of paintings done by the abstract expressionist American Barnett Newman. You may remember him from ATPPO 2, Bland or Brilliant Color Works. Newman completed works from 1966 to 1970, also titled Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue. Getting back to Tiravaniha's piece itself, it's very simple, and yet, for that reason, it's all the more impactful and conceptual. He converts a gallery of a museum into a kitchen and simply serves rice and Thai curry for free. The transition of gallery or back room spaces and offices into kitchens allows the public really important and rare behind-the-scenes looks that they can relate to by seeing all the contents of these various rooms and offices that get moved into other exhibition spaces. These kitchen-type events are extremely Duchamp influenced. Their art simply because Tiravaniha says they are. Their placement in the galleries make them interactive art and not art, and aligns with the infamous artist's idea that presenting content in a given context allows it to have more meaning than how it was made. Perhaps most importantly, Tiravaniha's Untitled, as well as Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, Green, and other such curry-based works, are entirely focused on experiential relationships. They set museum goers free from the expectations of being quiet and solo and thoughtful only in the gallery space. It allows them to interact with contemporary art in sociable ways, not just for later documentation, but in real time. They're not just looking at things, they're within the performance, and this reduces the distances between artists, participants, and blurs those labels, makes them far less important. And that entirely is Tiravaniha's purpose. The artist behind our main and really only ultra-contemporary artwork is one featured in our first Honey Drop, James Catalan. He is an Italian artist best known for his very tongue-in-cheek art. For example, his 2016 piece America is a fully functional golden toilet. CNN reports not only was it installed in New York's Guggenheim in 2016, it was open to use by visitors. Later in 2019, it was stolen from the birthplace of Winston Churchill at Blenheim Palace in England, where it was on exhibition, and it's never been seen again since. The work we are going to talk about extensively by him today absolutely broke the internet in 2019, a piece called Comedian. Created in a 1 of 3 edition, it is quite simply a fresh banana duct taped to a wall. Catalan previously used duct tape suspension for work titled A Perfect Day back in '99 when he fastened the art dealer Massimo De Carlo to a gallery wall with it. Comedian is considered a piece of conceptual art. It's not only technically the banana and duct tape, but it also comes with a certificate of authenticity with lots of detailed diagrams on how precisely to duct tape it, as well as instructions for the proper display. both of those objects, the banana and the duct tape, can be replaced as needed. So the physical representation of comedian is not really the point of it. For anyone else who watched WandaVision, this smacks very much of the Theseus ship problem. 2 separate editions of the piece sold for $120,000 each at Art Basel Miami Beach that year, with lots of media attention given to those sales. The third was donated to the Guggenheim. As you may recall, the world had quite a bit to say about this piece. At the time, The Guardian called it, quote, a questionably genius work. It calls to mind the old Lucille Bluth Arrested Development gag about rich people not knowing the price of a banana, end quote. Whereas ArtNet wrote that the piece was one of the worst of the week, that Catalan, quote, somehow duped a group of collectors into buying bananas duct taped to walls for $120,000 a pop, seriously, end quote. Others even chose to mock the artworks through satirization. According to Wikipedia, quote, designer Sebastian Errázuriz taped a dildo to a wall with duct tape and listed it for sale for $12,000, end quote. And then people, of course, did what you do with food, and they ate it. One of the 3 renditions was eaten after it was sold while still on exhibit at Art Basel as a part of an artistic intervention by the performance artist David Datuna called Hungry Artist. The banana was replaced that same day, and no legal action was taken against the Georgian artist, though he was asked to leave the fair at the time. Later, in April of 2023, the piece located in the Liam Museum of Art was eaten by a student by the name of No Hyun-soo, who then taped the peel back onto the wall. When asked by museum staff why he ate it, he simply said he skipped breakfast that day and he was hungry. And as if all that somehow still isn't enough, there was then a lawsuit filed about the artwork. It was filed by artist Joe Morford, who claimed in his suit that Catalan infringed on his own 2000 work titled Banana and Orange, which features plastic replicas of said fruits duct taped to 2 green panels. Morford claimed not only that Catalan may have seen his work, but was definitely influenced by it. However, the judge overseeing the case on June of 2023, Robert Scholar Jr., granted Catalan's request for summary judgment and thereby closed the case before it ever even saw trial. The Southern Florida District Judge said that there wasn't enough evidence that Catalan had seen Morford's work at all, and more importantly, the concept shared by the works of affixing fruit to any vertical plane just by using duct tape isn't protected under copyright. I've mentioned before that the only way to win an artistic copyright lawsuit case is to prove that the similarities are not only significant but outweigh the differences in that significance. In this case, Scola believed that Morford did not meet those 2 requirements, that there were very important differences in the ways that the banana was placed. All right, everybody, that is Art That Pisses People Off, Part 5, Going Bananas. And that is also it for our dearly beloved and now departed Art That Pisses People Off series overall. It's been a joy. I'm gonna miss her, but I am definitely ready to move on. Thank you for going on this journey with me and learning right alongside me. Thank you for your patience and constant interest, your desire to learn more. I very much appreciate it. I will catch you all next Tuesday with a brand new business episode. And until then, take care, rest up, hydrate or dihydrate. This podcast was created, produced, written, hosted, edited, and fact-checked by Master's graduate Celia Bugno. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.